We humans have difficulty imagining large spans of time that stretch well beyond our 70 or 80 or 90 years of life. We can perhaps imagine 100 years or a few hundred years, 1,000 years or a few thousand years, but hundreds of thousands, millions, or even billions of years, those spans of time are harder to grasp. So scientists have come up with analogies to help us imagine time and our place in it. You've probably heard of the analogy that takes the history of our 4.5 billion year old planet and boils it down to a single day. But let's zoom out. Another analogy helps us understand our place in the history of the universe. In this analogy, the 13.8 billion year history of the universe is condensed down to a single calendar year. The Big Bang kicks things off January 1st, and then we wait. It takes over 4 months, 1/3 of a year, for our galaxy, the Milky Way, to form in May. It then takes another 4 or 5 months for our solar system to form in September. While life on planet Earth begins in October, it takes until Christmas, December 25th, for dinosaurs to appear. Modern humans don't appear until December 31st, New Year's Eve, 8 minutes before midnight. All of recorded human history happens within the last 30 seconds of the year. Christ is born not until 5 seconds before the new year, and the United States only appears within the final second. The average human life is barely a quarter of a second long. From this cosmological perspective, to say that human beings are minor characters in the story that is the universe would actually be an overstatement. We are a species on a small speck of dust on the outer edge of the galaxy that contains 250 billion stars. Our galaxy in turn is part of a supercluster called Laniakea, meaning immeasurable heaven in Hawaiian, which has 100,000 galaxies, of which we are again on the outer reaches. And Laniakea is one of the 10 million superclusters in the universe. This astronomical view of the universe can fill you with either divine awe or nihilistic dread. Regardless of how thinking about the immensity of the universe makes you feel, your frame for thinking about yourself, your life, and the people around you can't help but shift, even if just for a moment. In our first reading today, we find Job kind of where he was last week, upset at God, but it's 12 chapters later. In these 14 verses from chapter 31, Job basically says, look, if I had sinned doing X, Y, or Z, then yeah, I would have deserved what happened to me. But I didn't do any of those things. In fact, even when temptation came, I resisted evil. I didn't celebrate when my enemies came to ruin. I didn't turn away travelers when they needed a place to stay. In verse 34, Job gets so upset, he interrupts himself in the middle of a sentence, not finishing his thought. This self-interruption is actually a rhetorical device called aposiopesis, which is often used to express emotion so great you can't continue to speak. He ends this portion of his speech by demanding that God answer him to explain why, if he hasn't sinned, his fortune has been so awful. And in the second reading, 7 chapters later, in chapter 38, God answers. And God says, well, we were hanging out in heaven, and I was bragging to my buds that there's this human I created, that would be you, Job, and he's so into me, he'd never forsake me. And one of my buds, who just happens to be named Satan, says, oh yeah, I wonder why that is. You've pretty much given him everything that he could ever want. And so I say, so what's your point? And Satan says, I'll make you a bet that if Job has everything he has taken away from him, he'll curse you to your face. And so I think to myself, this Job guy really loves me, for me, right? And not because I give him nice things. So I say to Satan, deal. You can take away from him whatever you want, except his life. We shake on it, and then, well, all that bad stuff happens to you. What can I say? He called my bluff. I didn't think he'd do all of those things to you. But, since I am God and all, how about I make you some more kids? Okay, that's not actually what God says. Although in Bible study this week, someone suggested that maybe this is exactly what God should have said. But no, what God does is give Job an ancient Near Eastern Astronomy 101 class in which God basically gives the verbal version of a divine resume. So first, God created the earth, whose measurements God triple-checked. God created the stars, the ocean, which then God tamed, the clouds, sunrises, the ocean, again, light and darkness. Oh yeah, and God provides this resume while speaking with a voice from a whirlwind, just for dramatic effect. All joking aside, God's response to Job seems to be a kind of non-answer. Despite God's reply going on for 3 more chapters, spoiler alert, God never answers why Job's life, which had been so good, was now so miserable. God's response seems kind of rotten, and maybe it was, but I want to offer a different interpretation. What if God was trying to shift Job's perspective? What if God was trying to get Job to think about his life from a different angle? What if God was asking Job, who has a whole book of the Bible named after him, to decenter himself? When I read Job chapter 1, I read of a man who was the center of his universe. He had 10 children, thousands of sheep and camels, hundreds of oxen and donkeys, and very many slaves. The author of the text calls Job the greatest of all the people of the East. But it doesn't sound like his children worked, and it doesn't sound like he really worked either. These facts don't mean Job wasn't blameless and upright, but these facts do suggest that Job was incredibly privileged. And maybe when he loses everything, he's not just grieving the loss of his family, which is certainly deserving of sympathy. Maybe he's also grieving the loss of his stature, of his central position in the land of Uz. And maybe God's speech about the vastness of the universe is a reminder to Job that he is not, and indeed never was, at the center of it. The past few months in the life of our country have been particularly challenging. We have a pandemic on our hands, the likes of which we have not seen for 100 years, and we are yet again having a national conversation about racism. These two challenges have something in common. In order for us to overcome them, they both require at least some of us to revise our ordinary frames of reference and decenter ourselves. One of the major obstacles to controlling the pandemic is that it requires us as Americans to shift our perspective. From a young age, many of us who are Americans are taught that we are the protagonist in our own story. What should you do with your life? Follow your dreams. Why did Jesus die? So you can get into heaven. Should you listen to people with more experience and knowledge than you? No, it's a free country and you have the right to do whatever you want. Our culture prizes individualism, nonconformity, and personal libertarianism. We are a first come, first served society. We get what's ours and encourage everyone else to do the same. And we want to be comfortable at all costs. For example, we ignore that our energy consumption is choking the planet, that our meat and seafood consumption costs the lives and well-being of sentient creatures, and that the price of our voracious appetite for electronics is in effect continuing the practice of slavery in places like Congo and China. So it's no wonder that in the middle of a pandemic, when we are asked to modify our behaviors to protect other people and even save lives, we struggle. If we don't normally have to think about how our actions affect other people, especially people we don't know, never see, or quite frankly don't care about, why would we do so now? Why would we suddenly wear uncomfortable and voice-muffling masks or forego birthday parties, plane rides, restaurants, or concerts? Certainly, I don't mean to minimize the real mental suffering and economic hardship that comes with pandemic life. Nor do I mean to minimize the fact that our country has had a failure of leadership. But we are so used to stories that place us at the center of the narrative that it's hard, even when faced with a life or death situation, to change our behavior. Yet I believe God is calling us, individually and collectively, to think about the bigger picture. Yes, God cares about our suffering, but maybe God is also asking us to think about RNA viruses, immunology, epidemiology, global economic systems, infection, and mortality rates. Maybe God is asking us to decenter ourselves during this public health crisis, or to at least have a decentering frame available to help guide our collective and individual responses to COVID-19. And then there is the question of race, a question that has plagued our country since before it was even a country, a question I wonder if we'll ever fully address. We, people of color, are asking white people to do something very difficult but necessary. We are asking white people to decenter themselves. In our country, whiteness is the center, the norm, the standard. White people are the main characters in books and films and TV shows. White people, and usually white men, are our presidents, judges, representatives, CEOs, newscasters, experts, superheroes, and even in the form of white Jesus, our saviors. For many people, this world seems right, unproblematic, just the way it is. For white people, it is comfortable to the point of the system being invisible. Well, white people, this may be your God and Job moment. In this moment of heightened attention to racial injustice, you may feel that you have to walk on eggshells, that it's uncomfortable, that you have guilt. You may be afraid of being called racist. You may protest that racism isn't your fault, that your ancestors didn't own slaves, that you've had a hard life too. God is speaking to you now and telling you a story, and you are not at its center. Will you listen and step into this new story God is giving you? A story that brings life to all and not just a few? And what does God say to those of us who have been and continue to be decentered? What does God have to say to us, Black and other people of color, at this moment? God in Jesus says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you who are meek, for you will inherit the earth." To my Black siblings and siblings of color, I say that we are blessed. God is deeply moved by our suffering. When white people ignore us, silence us, or treat us as if we're invisible. When we are passed over for raises and promotions that we know we deserve as much as our white colleagues. When we are called racial slurs. When we are stopped, beaten, and killed by the police or other vigilantes. The fact that we are wealth poor compared to our white counterparts. That we are dying from COVID-19 at disproportionate rates. That we have to continually show white people that racism exists and argue for our existence and equality. God, who identifies and participates in our suffering through Jesus, is writing a story where we are no longer at the margins. And when God writes a story, that story becomes reality. Maybe not today, or tomorrow, or next week, or even next year, but I have faith that ultimately God will mold our world so that it conforms to the divine story that God is writing even now. We may at first bristle at God's reply to Job while admiring the Beatitudes, but both, I would argue, are doing the same thing. They are changing the narrative. They are reframing reality. God is rewriting our human stories and turning everything upside down. The centered are being decentered, and the decentered are being centered. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Will you step into God's story